The father's justice. The most dangerous thing your partner can do isn't cheating. It's quietly deciding you're not worth protecting anymore. That morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table, one hand around a mug of coffee that had already gone cold, still wearing yesterday's shirt, not thinking about anything important. Just a normal morning. Quiet. Predictable. Laura walked in already dressed for the day, blazer sharp, heels precise against the floor, her attention split between me and whatever was happening on her phone. She didn't greet me. Didn't slow down. Just reached into her bag, pulled out a thin stack of papers, and set it beside my coffee. Clean, deliberate, like she'd rehearsed that exact motion. "My lawyer's drafted something," she said, not looking up. I glanced at the top page. Legal letterhead. My name printed in a font that felt impersonal. "What is it?" I asked, even though something in my chest had already gone still. "A prenup," she replied, calm, flat, the same tone you'd use to mention a meeting or a delivery. "I should have done it earlier. I'm not risking my future on uncertainty." Uncertainty. She said it like I was the variable, like I was the thing that couldn't be trusted. I picked up the document. 11 pages. Structured. Precise. Her signature, already sitting near the back. Confident. Finished. Mine was left blank, like a formality she expected to be completed. "You can take your time," she added, adjusting her sleeve. "Stephen Price is available if you have questions. No hesitation, no emotion, no we. Just a transaction, with a wedding ring still on her finger." I looked down at the pages again, at the section where my assets were described in vague, dismissive terms, like I didn't have anything worth protecting, like losing me wouldn't cost her anything at all. She grabbed her bag, finally glancing at me for half a second. "It's just smart, Jack. You understand that, right?" Then she walked out. The door closed softly behind her, and the kitchen went quiet again, except it didn't feel like the same room anymore. I sat there a little longer than I should have, staring at a version of myself she had already decided on, a man with nothing to lose, nothing to protect, and apparently nothing worth fearing. And that's when it hit me. She didn't just want protection from me. She thought I was the risk. I met Laura Bennett on a Wednesday night. I almost skipped, one of those alumni mixers where everyone talks just enough to sound interesting, but not enough to say anything real. The room was warm, a little too crowded. Soft lighting reflecting off glasses and polished shoes. Conversations overlapping into a low, steady hum. I had already decided I'd stay 30 minutes, shake a few hands, then leave. I was standing near the back, close to the bar, holding a club soda I hadn't touched, when she stepped in beside me, like she'd been there the whole time. "You're not trying very hard," she said, glancing at the room, then back at me. Her tone, light, but measured. I looked around, then at her. "Neither are you." That made her smile, quick, genuine, not the kind you practice in front of a mirror. "Laura Bennett," she said, extending her hand. "Jack Turner." Her grip was firm, confident. She didn't look past me while we spoke, didn't check her phone, didn't scan the room for someone more useful. That alone made her stand out. We talked longer than I expected, about work, but not in the usual way. She spoke clearly, directly, about scaling, operations, managing pressure, making decisions people don't see. No filler, no hesitation, just precision. When she mentioned she was running a logistics company, it didn't sound like she was impressing me. It sounded like she was stating a fact. And for some reason, that pulled me in. When she asked what I did, I kept it simple. Consulting. Mostly stepping back these days. She nodded once, like that answer was enough, and didn't push further. At the time, I thought that meant she respected boundaries. Now, I think it meant she'd already decided what I was worth. Later that night, I found Mike Carter near the exit, jacket already over his shoulder. He followed my glance across the room, then looked back at me with that expression he gets when he's choosing his words carefully. "She's sharp," he said. "Yeah," I replied. Mike took a slow sip of his drink, eyes still on me. Just don't assume she's missing anything." I let out a small breath. "It's just a conversation." He nodded, but not like he agreed, more like he'd said what he needed to say. I remember the drive home, the city lights stretching across the windshield, everything quiet except the sound of the tires on the road. I replayed small details, the way she listened, the way she held eye contact, the way nothing about her felt accidental. I didn't tell her much about myself that night, not because I was hiding anything, I just didn't see the point. I'd learned a long time ago that the less you explain, the more people fill in the gaps themselves. With Laura, I thought she saw something anyway. We started seeing each other after that. Nothing rushed. Dinners that lasted longer than planned. Mornings that felt easy. Conversations that didn't need effort. She fit into my life without friction. Or maybe I made space without noticing. Somewhere along the way, without a clear moment I could point to, I stopped questioning it. I stopped analyzing the details, stopped looking for what didn't add up. I just accepted what was in front of me and told myself I'd been lucky to meet her. And that's the part that stays with you. Not the moment it breaks, but the moment you realize you chose to believe it was real. The first months of our marriage looked normal. Quiet dinners at home, weekends that didn't need planning, mornings where we moved around the kitchen without speaking much but still understanding each other. Laura would leave early, come back late, but there was still a rhythm to it, something that felt stable enough to trust. If anyone had looked from the outside, they would have seen a couple that worked. It wasn't one moment that changed things. It was a pattern, small at first, easy to ignore. She started taking more calls at the table, not urgent ones, just constant. Her phone face down, then lighting up again, her attention shifting before I finished a sentence. I'd be halfway through something, and she'd nod without really hearing it, eyes already somewhere else. "You were saying?" she'd ask sometimes, but not because she wanted to know, just because it was expected. There were dinners where she spoke more about board meetings than anything else, names I didn't recognize, decisions that didn't involve me, problems that seemed to matter more than anything happening in our own house. I listened, asked questions, refilled her glass when it got low. It felt easier than pointing out the distance. At events, I noticed something else, the way she introduced me. "This is Jack, my husband," she'd say, but her tone stayed the same as when she mentioned a colleague or a client. Then she'd pivot, quickly, back to her company, her growth, her numbers. I'd stand there beside her, shaking hands, smiling when expected, but it felt less like being included and more like being positioned. Like I completed a picture she needed people to see. Once, at a dinner with investors, I watched her from across the table, the way she leaned forward when she spoke, the way people listened. There was confidence in every movement, control in every pause. And when someone asked about her personal life, she smiled and placed her hand lightly on my arm and said, "He keeps things grounded." And grounded. That word stayed with me longer than it should have. At home, it showed up in smaller ways. She stopped asking about my day. Not suddenly, just gradually. Questions became shorter, then disappeared altogether. Conversations turned into updates. Hers, mostly. I adjusted without thinking. Spoke less. Filled the silence where needed. Nothing dramatic. No arguments. No scenes. Just a slow shift in how space was shared. There were nights she came home and went straight to her laptop, the glow from the screen lighting her face while the rest of the room stayed dim. I'd be at the table, finishing dinner alone, listening to the soft clicking of keys from the other side of the room. "Long day?" I'd ask. "Always," she'd reply, without looking up. It wasn't cold. Not exactly. Just distant. Like her attention had been reassigned somewhere else. I started noticing how often that happened, how many times a day I adjusted, waited, stepped back without being asked, how easily I fit into the background of her schedule, her priorities, her version of what mattered. And the strange part was, nothing about it felt urgent enough to confront. No single moment you could point to and say, "That's where it broke." Just small things. repeated often enough that they stopped feeling small. And somewhere in that repetition, I found myself sitting in the same house, at the same table, across from the same person, starting to wonder when exactly I became optional. It happened on a Sunday afternoon that didn't feel important, the kind of quiet day where nothing is supposed to change. Laura was at the office, or at least that's what she'd said before she left that morning, already on a call before the front door closed. I was at the kitchen table with my laptop open, going through routine paperwork, insurance renewals, property files, the kind of things that don't require much thought but still need to get done. We kept a shared folder, nothing unusual, tax records, contracts, scanned documents, organized, labeled, clean. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just following a trail of files that led from one folder to another. At some point, I clicked into a subfolder labeled Archive. It wasn't hidden, just tucked away. Inside there were a handful of documents, old agreements, past versions of things we'd already finalized. I moved through them quickly, barely reading, until one title made me stop. Exit Strategy. No date, no initials, just 2 words, sitting there as they belonged. I hovered for a second, then opened it. The screen is filled with text, structured, numbered sections, clean formatting, the kind of document someone takes time to get right. I read the first paragraph once, then again, slower this time. It wasn't written like a personal note, or even a reflection. It was written like a plan. Year markers, bullet points, timelines, language that didn't leave room for interpretation, only execution. Our marriage wasn't described as a relationship. It was outlined like an asset structure. My role, or what she believed it to be, was positioned in neutral terms: stable presence, low visibility, minimal financial exposure. I sat back slightly, not because I needed distance, but because the words didn't make sense up close. I kept reading. Year 2, consolidate shared accounts. Year 3, expand public asset base. Year 5, initiate separation under controlled terms. No hesitation in the language, no uncertainty, just sequence. My eyes moved down the page, slower now, catching details I hadn't noticed at first. References to investor perception, lifestyle optics, risk management. It was all there, laid out in a tone that felt almost clinical. And then, halfway through the document, a name. Ryan Cole. I knew the name. Of course I did. He'd been at dinners, meetings, someone she worked with closely. Someone who always seemed comfortable around us, who shook my hand like we'd known each other longer than we had. There it was, in plain text, connected to a section that didn't need explaining, just enough context to make everything else shift. I stopped reading for a moment, not because I didn't want to continue, but because something had already changed. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the realization that none of this had been written in a moment of anger, or doubt, or confusion. This was intentional, planned in advance, structured over time, built with the kind of clarity that doesn't come from impulse. I went back to the beginning and read it again, slower, noticing how consistent it all was. Every line is connected, every step accounted for. There were no gaps, no uncertainty, nothing left to chance. I closed the laptop halfway, then opened it again. The kitchen was quiet. Same light coming through the window, same chair beneath me, same table I'd sat at 100 times before, but none of it felt the same. I looked at the document one more time, at the headings, the timelines, the way everything had been mapped out long before I ever thought to question anything. And somewhere between those pages, I realized something that didn't come all at once. This hadn't started when things felt distant. It had been there from the beginning. I just hadn't known where to look. I didn't confront Laura that day, and that wasn't weakness. It was the first smart decision I made after reading that file. I closed the laptop, sat there for a minute, and listened to the house settle around me. The faint hum of the refrigerator, a car moving past outside, the soft tap of a branch against the kitchen window. Everything looked exactly the same. That was the strange part. The same table, the same light on the counter, the same coffee ring near my hand. But I was not sitting in the same marriage anymore. I could have called her. I could have marched into her office, dropped the document in front of her, and asked her to explain Ryan Cole's name to my face. I could have raised my voice, demanded answers, forced the whole thing into the open before sunset. For about 10 seconds, I understood why people do that. Shock wants movement. Pain wants noise. It wants to prove it exists. But the more I sat there, the clearer it became. If I confronted her while she still held the map, I would only be stepping into the version of the story she had already prepared for. She had the language, the timing, the excuses. She had already thought in stages, already put our life into categories and outcomes. If I exploded, she would know exactly what I knew, and from that moment on, every smile, every account, every conversation would tighten shut. I wouldn't be gaining truth. I'd be warning her. So I did the opposite. I went into the kitchen and started making dinner. Nothing elaborate. Pasta, garlic and olive oil. Water is boiling on the stove, the kind of meal that gives your hands something to do while your mind catches up to reality. I set 2 plates on the table, poured a glass of wine, wiped the counter when I didn't need to. By the time Laura came home, the house smelled warm and ordinary. "Something smells good," she said, dropping her bag by the door. "Dinner's ready," I told her. And that was it. No accusation, no loaded glance, no test questions slipped into casual conversation. We sat across from each other and ate like we had 100 times before. She talked about a meeting that ran long, a vendor issue, and a number she didn't like on a quarterly report. I nodded in the right places, asked 1 or 2 questions, refilled her glass when it got low. When she stood up to take a call, I cleared the plates and ran water over them at the sink, my face steady in the dark reflection of the window. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. That was the part I had to understand first. Silence is not surrender when the other person believes they're still hidden. Silence gives you time. Time lets you watch. Watching tells you what anger never will. The second I showed her my pain, she would start protecting herself. The second I showed her, I knew, the truth would go underground. So I kept living as if I didn't. We still had coffee in the same kitchen. We still crossed paths in the hallway. We still talked about groceries, schedules, dinner plans, and things that needed fixing around the house. But I was no longer hearing her the same way. Every answer became information. Every delay meant something. Every sudden kindness had weight. I stopped reacting and started noticing. The hurt didn't disappear, it just lost heat. It became colder than that, cleaner, more useful. And sometime later that night, lying beside her in the dark while she slept like nothing in the world had shifted, I stared at the ceiling and realized that if I was going to survive this with any dignity at all, I couldn't move first. I didn't call Frank Dawson right away, and that delay mattered more than anything I said to him later. I gave it a few days, watched the routine hold, made sure nothing on the surface had shifted. When I finally reached out, it was a short call, no details over the phone, just a time and a place. His office sat halfway up a narrow building in the financial district. Old wood floors, tall windows that let in more gray light than sun. Frank looked exactly the same as he always did. Sleeves rolled, tie loosened, a legal pad already open before I sat down. He didn't ask how I was, just glanced at me once and said, "Talk." So I did. Not dramatically. No pacing, no raised voice. I walked him through it step by step. The shared folder, the document, the timelines, the name. He didn't interrupt. Just wrote a few things down, paused once or twice, then let me keep going. By the time I finished, the room felt quieter than when I'd started, like the story had taken up all the air. He leaned back in his chair, tapping the pen lightly against the pad. "So," he said after a moment, "what do you want?" It wasn't a legal question. It was the only question that mattered. "I don't want a scene," I said. "I don't want to lose control, and I'm not interested in reacting to something she already planned." He nodded once. "Then we don't react," he replied. "We build." That was the shift. We didn't start with anything complicated. No long explanations, No technical language. Just a clear idea. If she had mapped out an outcome based on what she thought I was, then everything had to move in a direction she wasn't looking at. Quietly. Step by step. Frank drew a simple line across the page, then marked a few points along it. We separate what's visible from what isn't, he said. Anything tied to you directly stays clean. Anything new goes somewhere she won't think to check. No jargon, no theory. Just structure. We talked through what that meant in practical terms. New entities, nothing flashy, nothing that would raise attention, names that didn't connect back to me on the surface. Accounts opened in the right order. Paper trails that made sense if someone looked, but didn't lead anywhere obvious. Each step was small on its own. Together, they changed the shape of the board. I didn't move anything fast. That was the point. If something shifts too quickly, people notice, so we spaced it out. Weeks between actions, sometimes longer. Enough time for everything to settle before the next piece moved into place. Frank handled the legal side, filings, documents, the parts that needed to be exact. I stayed focused on direction, where things should go, what needed to stay untouched, what could be repositioned without drawing attention. Every decision came back to the same idea. Control isn't about force, it's about placement. Meanwhile, at home, nothing changed. Same dinners, same conversations, same quiet routines that made everything look steady from the outside. Laura never asked about any of it. Never had a reason to. From her perspective, the structure she understood was still intact. That was what gave me room to work. By the time we were a few months in, I could feel the difference, not in anything visible, but in how decisions landed. I wasn't reacting anymore. I wasn't waiting for the next move to come at me. I was choosing where things went, even if no one else could see it yet. Frank closed his notebook one afternoon, sliding it across the desk slightly as if to underline the point. "You're not behind anymore," he said. "Just don't rush the part where she still thinks you are." I nodded, looking down at the page, at the simple marks that now represented something much larger than they had at the start. And as I stood to leave, I realized something had already shifted, not in her world, but in mine. And once that happens, the rest becomes a matter of timing. It didn't start with her company. It started with the edges of it. The places most people don't look because they assume control sits at the center. I began with the vendors she mentioned over dinner, the ones tied to timelines, delays, margins. Names that came up casually, without emphasis. A carrier struggling to hit delivery targets. A supplier stretched thin on cost. I didn't ask questions at the table. I just listened, then wrote those names down later, quietly, in a notebook that never left my desk. From there, it was simple in principle, just not obvious in execution. If you can't walk through the front door, you walk around the building and learn where the weight actually rests. I didn't need control of her company to influence it. I needed presence in the places it depended on, small positions, nothing loud. Enough to be part of conversations that mattered when contracts came up, when terms were renegotiated, when pressure started to build. Each move was indirect. A quiet investment here, a partnership structured through another layer there. Nothing tied back to me in a way that would draw attention. Just a steady positioning across the network that supported everything she was building. I didn't rush it. Weeks would pass between decisions, sometimes longer. Timing mattered more than speed. At home, none of that showed. We still sat across from each other at dinner. Same table, same routine. She would talk about a delayed shipment or a negotiation that wasn't going the way she wanted. I'd nod, ask a question at the right moment, and pass the salt when she reached for it. From her side, it probably felt like I was just following along, interested enough to listen, not involved enough to matter. What she didn't see was how those conversations lined up with what I was already watching. There was one night in particular, she was describing a contract that was slipping. Not dramatically, just enough to be frustrating. The kind of issue you expect to fix with a few calls, a few adjustments. She leaned back in her chair, exhaled, and said, "It'll stabilize. It always does." I remember looking at her across the table. the way the light from the kitchen fixture caught the edge of her glass, the reflection moving slightly as she shifted her hand. I nodded once, as I agreed, but I already knew who was sitting on the other side of that contract. I didn't correct her, didn't offer insight, just took another bite of dinner and let the moment pass like any other. That became the rhythm. She spoke. I listened. And somewhere outside that room, the structure was changing in ways she hadn't accounted for. Not enough to trigger alarms, not enough to feel like a threat. Just enough to reposition leverage over time. Ryan Cole's name came up occasionally, not in detail, just in passing. A meeting here, a call there. I paid attention to that too. The connections around him, the investments he was involved in, the patterns that repeated when his name entered the conversation. Same approach, nothing direct. Just proximity, layered carefully, until it mattered. There was no moment where everything flipped. No single move changed the game. It was slower than that, quieter. Like shifting weight from one side of a structure to another. So gradually that no one notices until it no longer stands the same way it used to. Months passed like that. On the surface, nothing had changed. Same routines, same conversations, the same version of me she thought she understood. Underneath, I wasn't reacting anymore. I wasn't waiting for her plan to unfold. I was building my own, piece by piece, in places she had never thought to look. And the more I moved through it, the clearer it became. This was never going to be decided by what either of us said. It was going to come down to who understood the structure better. A year later, the prenup came back to the table, almost exactly where she had placed it the first time. Same kitchen, same morning light, cutting across the counter. Same quiet between us that used to feel normal, but this time, nothing about it was the same, not for me. Laura sat across from me, composed as always. A pen resting near her hand like this was just another step in a process she had already completed in her head. Stephen updated a few clauses, she said, sliding the document slightly toward me. Nothing major, just clarity. Clarity. I picked it up without rushing, flipping through pages I already understood better than she did. The language hadn't changed much. It still protected what she had listed, still assumed what she believed I didn't. I've had Frank review it, I said, setting it back down. That was the first time her eyes held mine for more than a second. Good, she replied. Stephen's expecting any questions. There aren't any, I said. No hesitation, no correction. Just a statement. The shift didn't happen in the kitchen. It happened later, in a conference room neither of us was in. Frank Dawson sat across from Stephen Price, a long table between them, the kind of space designed for calm conversations that carry weight. Papers were laid out neatly, not stacked, not hidden, just placed where they could be seen. Stephen started the meeting the way someone does when they think they already understand the situation. Measured tone, controlled pace. He walked through the prenup, line by line, explaining protections, outlining assumptions, reinforcing the structure Laura had built. Frank didn't interrupt. He waited. Then, when Stephen finished, Frank slid a separate set of documents across the table, slower than necessary, giving the movement its own emphasis. Before we proceed, he said, there's context your client may not have accounted for. No dramatics, no raised voices. Just information. Stephen glanced down, then paused. Not long, just enough to read the first page, then the second. His posture shifted slightly, not visibly to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but enough that Frank noticed. Enough that it mattered. What is this? Stephen asked. Assets not previously listed, Frank replied, fully documented. Silence followed, not the comfortable kind, the kind where someone recalculates without saying it out loud. Stephen turned another page, then another, each one adding weight without needing explanation. There was no argument, no pushback, because the structure Laura had built only worked under one condition, that everything she believed about me was true. Frank let the silence sit, then added, my client is prepared to proceed under the original terms. Stephen looked up. Without amendment? Yes. That was the part that mattered. No renegotiation, no demand, no attempt to adjust the agreement in my favor, just acceptance, on paper, of something that no longer balanced the way she thought it did. Stephen leaned back slightly, pen resting between his fingers, the first real pause in his voice since the meeting began. "I'll need to discuss this with Laura." Frank nodded once. "Of course." And that was it. No confrontation. No explanation was offered where it wasn't asked for. Just a shift, quiet, irreversible, built entirely on facts that hadn't needed to exist until they did. By the time I saw Laura again that evening, the document was still sitting where she'd left it, the pen untouched, the pages exactly as they had been that morning. But something had already changed. Not in what was written, but in what it actually meant. She was already home when I walked in, which, by itself, told me everything I needed to know. Laura didn't come home early unless something had shifted beyond her control. The kitchen was dim, late afternoon light barely reaching the table, no laptop, no phone in her hand. Just her, sitting there, still, like she'd been waiting for the room to catch up with her thoughts. I set my keys down on the counter, slow enough to give her space to speak first. "Stephen called me," she said, her voice steady, but quieter than usual. I nodded once. I figured he would. She looked at me then, really looked. Not the quick glance she used to give between tasks, but something more focused, measured. "How long?" she asked. I didn't pretend to understand, since I found the file. Her eyes shifted slightly, not away, just inward, like she was placing that moment somewhere on a timeline she hadn't expected to change. "The archive folder," she said. "Yes." Silence settled between us, not heavy, not explosive, just exact. "You didn't say anything," she added. "Neither did you," I replied. That landed, not as an accusation, but as something that didn't need to be argued. She stood up slowly, walked toward the window, her reflection faint against the glass as the light outside dimmed. For a moment, she didn't speak. Just stood there, arms crossed lightly, the kind of posture that holds everything in place. "I underestimated you," she said finally, not turning around. There wasn't anger in it, just recognition. I stayed where I was. "Yes," I said, "you did." She turned then, facing me again, and for the first time since I'd known her, there was no structure in her expression, no controlled version of what she wanted to project. Just something unguarded, raw in a way that didn't fit her. "How much?" she asked. It wasn't curiosity. It was a calculation, trying to close a gap she hadn't seen coming. "Enough," I said. She exhaled slowly, one hand resting against the back of the chair, as if she needed something steady. "You built all of that, while living here, while—" She didn't finish the sentence. "Didn't need to." "You were planning your timeline," I said. I was adjusting mine. That seemed to settle something. Not in her favor, not in mine, just in reality. She studied me for a long moment, eyes moving slightly, like she was comparing the person in front of her to the one she thought she knew. "What do you want, Jack?" she asked, softer now. That question stayed in the air longer than anything else she'd said. I could have answered it a dozen ways, legal terms, practical outcomes, clean conclusions. But none of those were true. "I wanted a real marriage," I said, the words coming out simpler than I expected. Not a strategy, not something managed in phases, just real. The room went quiet again, the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. She looked down for a second, then back up, her expression already starting to rebuild itself, piece by piece, returning to something more familiar, more controlled. But not quite the same. Because now she knew, and more importantly, she knew I knew. And standing there, in the fading light, I could see it in her eyes. This wasn't about who won anymore. It was about what we had actually been, all along. The divorce didn't take long after that. Not because it was easy, but because there was nothing left to argue about. The paperwork moved the way paperwork does, quietly, precisely, without emotion. Frank handled the details on my side. Stephen handled hers. Meetings were scheduled, documents reviewed, and signatures placed exactly where they needed to go. No raised voices. No last-minute negotiations. Just a process reaching the end it had been moving toward for longer than either of us had admitted. Laura kept everything the agreement protected, the assets she had listed, the structure she believed she controlled. That part never changed. But the difference was in everything that had never been part of her calculation. The parts she thought didn't exist, or didn't matter. Those didn't belong to her. They never had. I moved out of the house the week it was finalized. 2 men came in the morning, careful with the boxes, quiet as they worked. I took what was mine, nothing more, nothing less. Left the rest exactly where it had always been. The kitchen looked the same when I walked out as it had the day she set that document down on the table. Ryan Cole disappeared from her world not long after. No announcement, no explanation offered publicly. Just absence. His name stopped coming up. His role was quietly reassigned. Whatever connection had once been there, it didn't survive the kind of light that had been turned on. As for me, I didn't step into anything loud. No public statement, no sudden change in how I lived day to day. The difference was in where I sat when decisions were made, the rooms I entered without needing an introduction, the conversations that now paused when I spoke instead of passing over me. Positions don't always come with titles at first. Sometimes they come with access, with influence that doesn't need to announce itself. And for the first time in a long while, I noticed something else. Silence felt different. Not the kind that sits heavy in a room, waiting for something to break. This was quieter than that, steadier. Like the background noise had finally stopped, and you could hear your own thoughts again without having to push through anything. I'd stand by the window some mornings, coffee in hand, looking out over the city as it moved the same way it always had. Cars passing, people walking. Nothing about the world had changed. But I had. There was no anger left in it. No need to prove anything. Just a clear understanding of what had happened and what I had chosen to do with it. I didn't lose what I built. I didn't lose control. And more importantly, I didn't lose myself trying to hold on to something that was never real to begin with. That's the part people don't talk about enough. Not the strategy, not the outcome, but the moment you realize you can walk away without carrying the weight of it with you. So I'm curious, if you were sitting in that same kitchen, holding that same document, knowing what it really meant, would you have said something right away? Or would you have stayed silent and let the truth take its time?